All right, now we're recording. Welcome again to the webinar for the 2025 Recreational Trails Program Grant Cycle. Just a few things before I dive in. We do have the Q&A available in your toolbar, so please try to use that for the questions as they come to you. I do have Naomi and CISO here helping, our Land and Water Conservation Fund coordinator, and she will be keeping an eye on the Q&A. And we will pause a couple times during the webinar, and then I'll hang out at the end for anything else that still needs to be answered or any more questions that come to mind later in the webinar. I also have chat on just in case there's any issues that you're having, but try to stick with Q&A for the most part, just it's a little easier for us to track that. And then, of course, if questions are left unanswered, you can get a hold of me after the webinar. And if any tech issues happen, hopefully not, but they have before, just hang tight. And with that, I will get started. So welcome again to the webinar. So we'll be going over a lot today. This includes program eligibility, application instructions, the scoring criteria we use, and more. But don't worry about furiously taking notes. I will email out the slides to everybody after we're done. And then within the next few days, the recording will be posted on our YouTube page and on the website, or on our public website for RTP. And there's a handful of links you'll see throughout the webinar. So those two will be included in the PDF version that you'll get after the webinar, so that you'll be able to click on those. And I know I'm going to pack a lot of information in here today. And there's going to be some slides that are text heavy, but really a lot of this is for you to come back to and reference once you dig into the application process. But before I talk about our programs, I wanted to make a quick plug for a couple other of our agency friends and their programs. Travel Oregon on October 1st, they're opening up their next round of Recreation Ready. This is a program that provides sorts of training, technical assistance, as well as funding for outdoor recreation projects. And if you have a project that maybe once you go through the webinar today, you realize maybe it's not quite ready to apply for construction dollars, this could be a good resource if there is more refinement or planning that you need to do, as well as any other projects you have going on at your organization. And then the State Marine Board, they are opening up their grant programs later this month on September 29th. That is for all things boating. The one unique thing about their funding is they can fund projects just for permitting or just for engineering. So if you have any type of boating project, they should always be your first go-to, as well as we'll talk a little bit about some of the boating projects that can fit within RTP, but definitely keep them in mind for anything else you got. So on this page is a list of our 5 recreation grant programs, 4 of which are open right now. So I'll be talking about RTP. Naomi, who's helping today, she is opening the Land and Water Conservation Fund on September 15th. That's another grant program or a federally funded grant program that we have. One second here. And then our local government grant program, that's our largest program that we have, and that typically opens every January. And then we have our ATV grant program for all things ATV trails, and that program's also open now. They have a letter of intent due on October 3rd. And lastly, we have our County Opportunity Grant Program, and that one is also open and is for county managed and owned campground projects. So applicant and project eligibility varies for each of these, which I'll show on the next slide. But some of your projects could be eligible or a good fit for more than just RTP. And then also not on this list, the Oregon Heritage Grant Program is also open right now. Within OPRD, our Heritage Division has a whole host of grant programs that do a lot of great historic preservation type stuff. And more. So definitely check out our website for that. And I know Naomi, looks like she already dropped a link in the chat just about where you can find our grant program. So check out our website if you haven't yet. So just another snapshot of those 5 recreation grant programs. On the left here, we have the different entity types, and on the top is the programs. So starting at the bottom, nonprofits, you're eligible for our 2 trail programs, RTP and the ATV grant program. Tribal governments are eligible for both of our federally funded programs, including RTP as well as ATV. And the federal agencies, similar to nonprofits, are just eligible for our trail grant programs. State agencies are eligible for both of our federal programs as well, including RTP and the ATV grant program. And then local governments are eligible for all of them, with the one nuance that county opportunity is just for counties. But if you're with a city, county, park, or port district, you're eligible for all of these. So here's your biggest takeaways for today, just where to find program information and how to get a hold of me. This first link at the top, that's a link to our online grant system. That's where you apply for our grants as well as manage any active grants you have. So when you do log in there, you see which grants are available to your organization. The big thing some of you may already be aware of is RTP should be in this list right now with the 2025. This is last year's screenshot. But it should be in this list, but it is not because we are having issues with our website, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But hopefully very, very soon you'll see RTP when you log in as an application that you can initiate. But this list will look different depending on which programs your organization is eligible for. This second link here, this is the link that Naomi also dropped in the chat. This brings you to our website where you can find information about all of our grant programs, both recreation and heritage. And then of course my email and phone number, and you can get a hold of me anytime with any questions you have about the application. We are here to help you. I know some folks always feel like they might be bugging us, but this is what we do, and we are here to help you navigate all of this stuff. And then this here on the right, this is just an image of the public facing website for RTP. So you can find all of your application forms and everything, and grant manuals, recordings of our workshops, etc. on that page. Once you're in the RTP page, we also have a variety of resources here, and these might be relevant to you whether or not you're even ready to apply for a grant. So all sorts of resources, both our own as well as external partners of ours, just to get you to their website. We also have a lot of really great accessibility guidance linked on our website, so check those out, as well as our statewide trails plan and statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan, which has lots of great info and good talking points for you as you're seeking funding. This is just a snapshot of the RTP projects that we have funded in recent years, but since the program started in the late or around 1999, Oregon has awarded over 500 grants for trail projects across the state. So whether or not you know it, you probably use trails funded by RTP over these last couple decades. So starting with an overview of RTP, the overall purpose of the program is to provide, expand, and improve public recreational trail opportunities. We fund all types of trails, everything from water trail facilities to paved urban trails, backcountry trails, ATV trails, equipment like the snow groomer you see in the bottom left, and lots and lots and lots of trailheads and bathrooms. RTP is federally funded. On the left, top left, it shows the Federal Highway Administration, or FHWA, as I'll refer to them as well. They're the federal agency that funds come from, or the RTP funds come from, and then funds flow through ODOT, with OPRD or state parks administering the program. This also highlights that there are a lot of hands and processes involved in the funding process with 3 agencies involved. So sometimes it can just take a little bit of patience once you are awarded. And just also want to acknowledge there's lots of questions right now surrounding federal funds. We still have our RTP funding, which was reauthorized in the last infrastructure bill, and it's authorized through the next federal fiscal year, with lots of bipartisan support for continuing the program in the next reauthorization, whenever that might be. So we are still moving projects forward. We are reimbursing expenses for active grants, despite some of the things that have been changing at the federal level. There has been some impacts to federal highways' capacity that's slightly impacted just sort of the speed of how things are moving right now. But I still have my main contacts at our Oregon office. And you might also be aware of a variety of executive orders that have come out, but doesn't mean that all those have actually trickled down into the program guidance for RTP or implementation. So for the most part, things are business as usual at the moment. And on the right, this infographic was created by the Coalition for Recreational Trails, or CRT. They're a national coalition that lobbies for RTP. And this shows the story of where RTP funds come from. So funds represent the federal gas tax that our motorized friends pay for their ATV and snowmobile riding. Then those funds are go into the Highway Trust Fund and made available for projects on all types of trails. So when the program was created in the 90s, all types of groups got together, and this is how they shaped it, that while it's paid for by our motorized friends, we can use these funds for all types of things, moto and non-moto. And you might notice that the amount of funding that goes into the Highway Trust Fund for RTP is more than what we get nationally. This is the national funding amount. And that is a issue, and there are advocates that have been trying to reconcile that amount. So I'm optimistic that someday, maybe even in the next reauthorization, we will see funding increase. But for now, funding has stayed flat for quite a few years. So now on to our schedule. So like I said, the application was meant to be available last Tuesday the 2nd. We are having some technical issues on our website where our application has gone a little bit berserk. But our IT staff have been working on it for the last couple days. And I'm really hoping that it gets online soon. Letters of intent, right now, we still have the deadline of September 30th. I know most people don't do those until close to September 30th anyway, but it's possible that we may need to push that out. And I do have right now a list of folks who have asked to be notified once the application is available, and I will make sure to include all of you that registered for this webinar on that list as well, so you're aware when it's open. And then applications are due online by November 15th. And the grant committee that oversees RTP, they'll come together next spring, likely in early March, to review proposals, hear your presentations, and recommend which projects to fund. And then their recommendations go to our agency commission next April. At their meeting, they'll vote to approve the projects. So if you are selected by our committee in March, this is a public meeting, first of all, the March meeting. So you can Zoom in, you can come. But we do make those recommendations available to you pretty much right following the meeting. And right now it's looking like next fall would be around the earliest that you would receive a notice to proceed to get started on your project. Things haven't in the last couple years, we were able to award a batch of projects more June, July, but it is taking just a little bit longer right now. So I think falls might be the earliest, but that'll depend on different factors with your project, which we'll talk a little bit about. So here is a snapshot of our base funding for the program. So Oregon, we get just shy of 1.6 million, and then about 100,000 of that is taken off the top for administration. So what we have is almost 1.5 million available for grants. The RTP legislation requires that 30% of funding goes to motorized. So that'll be about 450,000. And then we'll have a little over $1 million for non-motorized proposals. These amounts will increase as projects close under budget. I know right now we've probably got about 10,000 more of non-motorized that for projects that I'm closing right now that'll be rolled in there. And so if any motorized projects close under budget, those funds will go back into the moto pot, and same for non-motorized. So when you apply, when our application is available, you'll either select the motorized application or the non-motorized application. So pick the category of primary use, and then projects are ranked and scored by our committee within those two separate categories. So you'll either compete in the motorized pool or the non-motorized pool. If your project does benefit both types of trail uses, pick the primary type, and if you're not sure, just get in touch with me and I can work through some questions with you about what would be the best fit. And then of course our committee might weigh in a little bit differently when they come together. Common question in recent years is whether or not allowing e-bikes on a trail that's otherwise non-motorized would qualify you for motorized funding. And the answer to that is no. That to qualify for motorized funding, it does have to be trail or a trail adjacent project that benefits OHV or snowmobile users to qualify. So just some basics about the funding. So first of all, it is competitive. Non-motorized is much more competitive than motorized. but usually we fund about half or maybe a little bit over in the non-motorized. And I'll show us a little snapshot of that as well. This is a reimbursement program. So when you are awarded, we don't just hand you the big check. Instead, you are incurring costs and submitting to reimbursement requests to us as you go, and then a final when you are finished with the project. We do have options though for advanced payments on an invoice basis. We use this a lot with our nonprofit friends. So if cash flow is an issue, that doesn't mean you're out of the game. But if that's the case, there is a question on our application that asks if you have the cash flow to be paid on a reimbursement basis. And if not, you just indicate that and I'll follow up with you just on our guidance and some things to consider about that. As far as how much you can request, the minimum grant amount is $10,000. And for non-motorized proposals, we did increase we have a recommended max, so it's not a hard limit, meaning you can still ask for more if you've got a real great project that needs more money than that. But we did increase that recommended max to $200,000 this year. It was 150 for the last 5 or so years. So we bumped that up a little bit just with rising costs. And on the motorized side, there is no maximum. And that's just because that side, there actually have been many years where we haven't even gotten enough proposals to spend down all of our motorized funding. Lately, it has been slightly competitive, but we do not have a max for those reasons. You will need 20% match for your project, meaning you're contributing to 20% of the total project budget. But that doesn't just need to be cash. We can include things like volunteer labor, your in-kind staff time, other donations to the project, whether that be donated equipment or actual cash donations. And something to note too is if you apply with a match over 20%, you will be held to that through the life of the project. So we can't, once we make an award, if you have committed to over 20%, we can't lower it after the fact. So just keep that in mind as you are thinking about what you can actually commit to the project. And with your match, as you think about what you have for match, just keep in mind that everything we are counting as match or paying for has to be documented and tracked. So especially with staff time, that's something to get ahead of. Like, do you have a system to track that staff time? Are your staff willing to track their time? Especially if you have partners involved, etc. So just be ready to send us a lot of paperwork for those payments. And then if you're funded, you have about 2 years to complete your project. That is important to keep in mind as you're putting together your scope and your timeline. So be realistic about what you can get done in a normal 2 years. We do have the ability to extend grants. We do that time to time, especially for things like fire shutdowns or if there's bidding issues that delay the implementation, etc. But just as you're planning, think about what is realistic in a 2-year frame. If you are with a federal agency and you are the applicant and would serve as a grantee, RTP law does require that 5% of your total project costs comes from a non-federal funding source. Usually what federal agencies do is they involve volunteers in some way in their project. I know that can be hard if all you need is equipment or a bathroom, but I can work with you on some creative ways we can do that. There are proposals to get rid of that rule, but for now, that is the current federal law that you have to have some non-federal match included. And then if you are a federal agency and that 5% limit applies, there are other sources of federal funds that we can count as non-federal. So if you have youth corps that have in-kind match or things like that, there are certain things we have some flexibility on. But again, get in touch if this is going to be an issue for you. So here's just some funding data from the last 5 grant cycles. As you can see, the first line here is for motorized. So motorized is less competitive. We've received 35 applications in this time frame and been able to fund 27 of those, where compared to motorized, we're funding about half of the proposals that we get here. And then this is the average grant amount that we've awarded under each category. So pretty similar, about $115,000, $120,000. And that does include a range of small projects, little $30,000, $40,000 projects, as well as larger projects under both of those categories. And we do have a list of past funded project on the RTP section of our website. I still need to get last year's up. I will do that soon, but you can see the last quite a few years. And then there's a link to a national database that has even more historical data if you'd like to take a look at that. So over the next few slides, I'll go over what's eligible for RTP. But outside of a project being eligible, you should also consider whether your project will be competitive and whether it's a good fit. So as far as being competitive, there's a lot you can do to sell your project or make a great case for it. It's not as simple as new trails being more competitive than restoring existing trails, or a long trail being more competitive than a short little gap that you're filling. So you all hold a lot of power to make a compelling case to the committee on why your project should be funded in a competitive funding scenario. So this doesn't cover everything, but are just some general questions to ask yourself about whether your project is a good fit. And then you should also think about how you're going to communicate these elements to the review committee in a simple and understandable way, especially the more subjective points in the beginning of the list. So first off, as is the basic intent of the program, what the project should have a primary purpose of providing or enhancing public outdoor recreational trail opportunities for your users. Does your project meet an unmet need or solve a problem? Maybe provide other kinds of benefits to trail users. So being able to tell that story. We do want to see that your project has gained public support and input through a public planning process. This is going to look very different for a new trail versus an equipment purchase, but we do want to see that you have public support for the process. And if it was something that needed to go through a more robust outreach process, that you can tell that story and show how your project meets those needs that were expressed. But we'll talk a little bit more too, just about how you can explain that for other types of projects too that maybe didn't trigger public planning. We want to see that your scope and budget are realistic. Again, you have 2 years to complete the project, and what you tell us you're going to do, we are going to hold you to. So be realistic upfront. If your project is on federal land, you do need to have your NEPA approvals in place. If your NEPA is not quite signed or done, that can work. We just won't forward any applications to our committee without the NEPA approval. So we have had projects where maybe they didn't have it by the November 15th deadline, but they got it in January, and we can typically work with that. So just talk to me if that's the case for you. And then for all projects, federal and non-federal land, just making sure that the necessary steps have been taken related to your land use approval, permits, environmental review, or anything else that applies to your project, just to ensure that you will have a shovel-ready project that can be completed within that 2-year time frame, beginning in late 2026 or 2027. And then if you are a nonprofit partnering with a public land manager, we need to see that your project has been vetted and approved. So if you're not already talking to them about what you're planning, you should be talking to them ASAP. And then I will go over some more tips later in the webinar, but again, always happy to take your calls and bounce ideas around about how to frame your project. So as far as eligibility requirements for your applicants, so this program is open to pretty much all public agencies that manage public recreational trails. So local government, state, federal agencies, tribal governments, as well as other government entities like park districts and port districts. We have a couple times in RTP given grants to a school district or a soil and water conservation district. Those are pretty unique. These are situations where those type of special districts actually manage a public trail that's accessible not just to the school or et cetera. So those could potentially fit where there are more restrictions on those type of lands in some of our other programs. If you're a nonprofit applicant, so there might be 2 buckets that you fit in. So there are some nonprofit public landowners that we have granted to, land trusts, friends groups that own land, different conservation groups, et cetera, as long as that land is open to the public. The way I'll be talking about nonprofits, though, a lot in this webinar is those that partner with a land manager where you're kind of serving as the project manager or fiscal agent for the project on those public lands. So you do have to be registered for at least 3 years prior to applying. I checked that in the Oregon Secretary of State database. But if you're working in like a border area and you're registered in California or Washington, we would just need to see evidence of that. You do have to have approval and sign off from the land manager and be coordinating with them on everything to make sure you can successfully implement. And if you're a nonprofit, you need to have a unique entity identifier, which we'll talk a little bit about that. And if you don't know what a UEI is, you might need one, or you need to check with a colleague at your nonprofit, and maybe you already have one. But that is just something you'll need to be awarded federal funds. But I'll talk a little bit more soon. And I do see a question about, can urban and community forestry funds be used as match? And the answer to that I think would be yes. As far as where your cash match comes from, we don't have restrictions on the source of where that comes from. I'll talk a little bit more too about match sources. So thanks for that. So the first bucket of project eligibility is construction of new trails. So this can be anything from a whole new trail system, expanding an existing trail system, a small link or gap that you're filling, or things like bypass trails, which we've seen on like busy mountain bike trails where you're actually separating users. So as you can see in this picture, it's a whole variety of things from paved trails to this mountain bike trail, and then this accessible trail with benches included. So we can pay for things too in any new construction project like benches, signs, etc., or any other amenities. And that goes for both new construction or improving of existing trails. And we do fund a lot of phased projects for this. Like this top middle photo is Mountain of the Rogue Trail System down near Rogue River, Grants Pass area. And they've actually come to RTP for multiple phases. So that is possible, again, because you want to be realistic about what you can do within a 2-year time frame. Next up is restoration or improvement of existing trails. So we don't fund just ongoing um, maintenance of trails, but we can do restoration and improvement projects, and that can cover a wide variety of things. So that can be trail reroutes, maybe for environmental protection or to improve the user experience. We do a fair amount of wildfire restoration, bridge replacements, accessibility improvements, as well as just signage that can, whether it's included in a larger project or on its own. And then, of course, yeah, like the improving the user experience. This is one in the middle that they were just improving some of the mountain bike features that have gotten degraded after time. And next we can fund trailheads. So this can be the parking area, staging areas, restrooms. We fund a lot of those, as well as kiosks that you've put up, or a combination of all those things into a trailhead project. And just one thing to note, if that the trailhead must have a direct and primary relationship with a trail. So if it's a parking area at a park that's got ball fields, playgrounds, etc., that wouldn't be a good fit for RTP. It should be the primary purpose to serve trails that connect to it. Next up, we can fund water trails. So in the federal guidance and the federal law, water trails are included as an eligible trail type. So there are some, you might be familiar with designated water trails, like the Willamette River Water Trail. That's a federally designated water trail. But water trails don't have to be designated to qualify, but need to show that there's paddling experience where you go sort of place to place where you're put in, and then takeout areas are along that. But so if the trail isn't a designated water trail and has like the map and everything, you need to provide some sort of map that are visuals just to show how that body of water functions as a water trail. And again, talk to Marine Board first, because they can help you with a lot of the more technical side of planning your project if you do have a dock or water trail project for us. Another category we can fund, which we're plugging more this year and also removed a little bit of restriction we had on it, is RTP can fund assessments for trail accessibility or maintenance. So in the past, Oregon had a state-specific rule that these assessments couldn't be more than $20,000 or 5% of our annual funding, but we got rid of that because there wasn't really a good reason for it. And sometimes these can be a little bit more than $20,000. So I especially want to highlight accessibility assessments. So you may have heard about some great work that groups are doing across the state in this area, and we hope that RTP can help continue that. But this could be assessing existing trails for accessibility improvements. So actually what design improvements you need to make, or to develop signage. It's really important in this space that you're providing signage or web information or both that have details about surface, slope, different trail details so that folks can make their own decision about whether or not a trail is accessible for them. So yeah, an assessment could be, you can do a proposal just for the assessment. So you're just doing the assessment, but not actually including those design improvements or trail improvements, just going to use that assessment to do those in the future. Or you can lump an assessment into a construction project. That is absolutely allowable. always has been. So if you want to have, if you're doing a new trail construction project or restoration, you want to have a consultant with lived experience there with you doing some of that planning as well as consulting during the implementation just to oversee and make sure those trails are staying accessible as intended. You can absolutely include that cost into your budget, and we recommend you do. Also eligible under this category are maintenance assessments. Talking with the committee, I don't think maintenance assessments will necessarily be competitive unless it's a really unique scenario. I think typically we'd look to the land manager to just sort of have the capacity to do that. But if there is a unique scenario where you need to do a large scale maintenance assessment of your trail systems with partners, et cetera, that could work. But I would recommend getting in touch with me just if you plan to do that. But definitely consider the accessibility assessments again, whether that's just an assessment or included in a construction project. And then we can also use RTP for acquiring land or easements for trail access. I will say this is very, very rare. This hasn't even happened in my 9 years with the program because RTP is, as you can see, a small funding source. And these acquisitions are usually much more than RTP can provide. But if you do have one that fits within RTP, fits within sort of the funding that we have, just know that as a federally funded source, you do have to comply with federal acquisition requirements, meaning getting a yellow book appraisal. So I think that's why we don't see them often in RTP. But get a hold of me if you have one, because there might be some things we want to review early on. And then we can also fund safety and education. So federal law allows us to use up to 5% of our annual funding, which is about $80,000 for user-facing safety and education. One unfortunate thing about that is it is limited just to one federal fiscal year. So if you apply for this funding and maybe you'll have trailhead ambassadors like it's shown on the right there go out, we can only cover 1 year of that. That's another thing we're trying to change, but that's as it stands right now. So we can only award up to 80,000 for these type of projects, and you would still compete within the motorized or non-motorized category, whichever is sort of the primary use that your safety and education work is doing. And so, yeah, we've done some work with Trail Keepers of Oregon and their Trailhead Ambassador program. Tread Lightly is another organization that's tapped into RTP to do some education on the motorized side of things. And we've got a few other examples from recent years. So the last category of eligible projects I'll talk about is equipment, but before I talk about that, I want to quickly talk about Buy America. So if you've interacted with RTP in past years, you may already be aware that there's been a long-standing Buy America law that applied to RTP under U.S. Department of Transportation, and that required that any steel incorporated into a project be domestically produced and certified as such. And this was really challenging in the past. And they had a waiver for a while, then they stopped their waiver, which pretty much got in the way of purchasing equipment because of the steel parts and not being much domestically produced equipment for the type of things you all do. But then in 2021, some new Buy America requirements came down. Build America, Buy America. You may have heard more about that in recent years. This applies to a lot of federal programs, and every federal agency does it a little bit differently. But the good thing is that's been helpful for our applicants is that in 2023, the U.S. Department of Transportation, which again is over RTP, approved a waiver that for any projects where there's less than $500,000 of federal aid funds included in the award budget and just included in your RTP budget, that those requirements are waived. And so most of our projects fall under that. This has allowed us to buy equipment again, which is really great for those of you who tap RTP for that. So you likely won't have to worry about Buy America, but if you have a really large project with other federal funds, especially if you're working with another federal agency in those funds who treats Buy America really differently, as some do, then that's something we'll have to look at. But in general, this is waived, and this waiver goes for another few years before it'll be reviewed again. So still in place for this upcoming cycle, unless something changes, but it's officially approved on paper at least. So that just brings me to the last eligible project category, which is equipment. So this would be purchasing or leasing equipment that's dedicated to trail building or trail maintenance. So equipment's defined in federal regs as items that cost 10,000 or more per unit and have a useful life of more than a year. So if you're just purchasing small tools within your project, that doesn't meet the definition of equipment, so it gets treated a little differently. If you're a nonprofit proposing to purchase equipment, we do need documentation of partnership with the land manager. So for, like all the equipment that our snowmobile friends purchase, we get letters from those Forest Service offices just, supporting the partnership. And we are well aware of those partnerships that they have, but we'll just need to see something that really just justifies where that equipment will be used, because it will have to be used on public trails that your organization is partnering with a land manager to maintain. And then again, we don't have to worry about Buy America for the most part. Okay, now we're going to get into a little bit about some other project costs that have some restrictions on them. So those were all just the categories of the types of projects that we fund, but now I'm going to get into a little more of the nuance within those. So because RTP is really intended to fund shovel-ready construction projects, again, if you're applying for construction, this doesn't apply to like safety and education or other things. But if it's a construction project, you can only have up to 15% of your total project cost for things like final design and engineering or permitting. Really, again, the intent that we fund mainly the actual construction and implementation of these projects. However, that 15%, we do not count accessibility assessments or cultural resource surveys in that. Those are things that might come up later on in the process. And of course, we want to encourage having accessibility assessments alongside those projects. So we're just looking at things like your final planning and design. We can count some pre-agreement expenses if you've incurred them as match. So if you are right now incurring some costs for planning or engineering, or if you'll be incurring those costs over the next few months, we can count those and you can show those in your budget as match. The limit just is that we can only go back 18 months from the notice to proceed date. So thinking ahead to if you're going to get your award next fall or winter, we can only go 18 months back from that to count it as match. And you do need pre-approval, but really what that means is in the application near the end of it, there's a financial section that asks about whether or not any of the items in your budget are pre-agreement, which should be clear in the budget to us, hopefully, but that's where you can describe any of that to us. And that is sort of our screening tool up front to know whether or not that we'll be able to count that. But you cannot start construction, do any ground disturbance. So if say you're working on a phase of a project right now and you want to count that in as your match, we cannot allow that because that construction has to go through the federal review and for environmental and and cultural resources. So we're really just mainly talking about things like planning, ARCI surveys, accessibility assessments, permits, things like that. Staff time. So this we did update, which impacts our nonprofit friends. So any staff that are working on your project in any kind of implementation role, so that could be actually on the ground construction, that could be your contracting work that you're doing in your office, it could be overseeing crews, doing things like that. So direct project implementation, you can count that as match. When it comes to reimbursement, though, for our government agencies who apply to and receive grants, you can only charge staff time to the grant if it's for temporary or seasonal employees that were hired for the project. Otherwise, we can only count your staff time as match, and that is consistent with our other project-based grants that we administer. However, if you're a nonprofit that has paid employees that do this work and will be doing this work on your project, this we did change that we can reimburse that. So before we were only counting that as match as well, but just with the different nature of supplanting and government agencies versus nonprofits, we did open up that we can reimburse nonprofits for their time overseeing and implementing the project. But as you think about counting time, whether match or reimbursement, everything's going to have to be documented. So if you are throwing into your match time for, say, your engineers or your archaeologists on staff to do their work. Make sure you have a conversation with them up front that all that time is going to have to be tracked and then documented so that we can have that paper trail showing the valuation in hours. So also, if say you're a nonprofit and you want to include time from the public land manager staff, again, have that conversation because that means they'll have to provide you with documentation that then you submit to us when it comes time for reporting. And then transportation facilities. So typically we don't fund things like sidewalks, bike lanes, or other more active transportation type facilities. However, if there's maybe a bike lane or a section of sidewalk that you need filled in to complete a gap in what is otherwise what you would consider a recreational trail, you might be able to make a case for that. But because ODOT is really where folks go for these type of facilities and they have funding for that, we do require consultation with them and that's something that you would just get in touch with me about and I can connect you to the current staff and might be involved in a conversation with them about, why RTP versus their funding. Because of course, trails can be both transportation and recreation. We're not splitting hairs on that, but we just want to look at really what is the best funding source for something that is really more active transportation. And then if you have a project that's within a road right of way, there are some other requirements that might come in if that road is considered a federal aid highway. That's something I can help you figure out and then go over what those different requirements will be. And then bike parks. I know these have grown in popularity. They're great. We love them. But if you are planning like a closed pump track or something within a park that doesn't otherwise connect into a trail system, that does not fit within RTP. We need to see that that pump track or bike park will support trails that connect to it. So you can put in skill features, little pump tracks. Like an example of one is Sandy Ridge Trail System. They've got a huge mountain bike trail system. And then the nonprofit partner has been working to build a little pump track in the parking lot for kids, beginners, etc. Something like that would fit because it's sort of that gradual skill building. But if it's just a closed off pump track in a park, if you're a local government, we have other programs we would recommend that you apply to instead. Interpretive signage, you can include interpretive signage. For whatever reason, we used to have a state restriction on this. We lifted that a few years ago, but we don't necessarily do full-on interpretive projects. There might be some other better funding sources for that, but if you're doing a trail project and you want to include interpretive signs along the trail or at the trailhead, you can include that in your project. And also, if you're just doing a safety and education project, that might be a space where there could be some appropriate interpretation signs to include there. And with interpretation or interpretive signage, usually there's tribal consultation, maybe consultation with other stakeholders or local partners. Make sure to factor in time for that. Think ahead to that. It's not something you should be doing in the end of it because that could it can take time and just to respect partners and tribal governments who may need to be consulted with that you build that in. When it comes to lighting, RTP does not fund projects just for the sole purpose of lighting. So if that's all you need, this is not a great funding source for that. But if you want to include lighting within a trailhead project or within a trail project, you can include costs for that. I know the word incidental is subjective, intentionally so. But again, the intent is that we're not just funding lighting projects, but it's just one element within something bigger. Law enforcement and emergency services, we do not fund that under RTP. That's in the federal rules. If you are working with ATV trails, we do have a whole law enforcement and EMS funding availability within the ATV program, but otherwise RTP is not a source for that. Although there have been situations that have come up where maybe we funded a large snowmobile grooming shed and the local search and rescue group needs to use a little corner of that for their supplies, or maybe needs to borrow the snowmobile you bought with RTP to go do a rescue. That can typically be allowed, just not for the primary purpose of law enforcement and emergency services. We know those things are very important for trails. It's just that RTP is not the program that can fund that. And these are things that are not eligible to be included in your budget. You cannot include a specific line item for a budget contingency. However, we do very much recommend that you are padding your budget for things like inflation and contingency within the individual expense line item. So just again, thinking ahead to the fact that you won't get a notice to proceed until next fall or winter, we do want you to factor in inflation to your labor, your materials, et cetera, within those specific line items. We don't fund planning only projects. You can include some of that final planning and design within a construction project, but aside from the accessibility assessments, we don't just fund planning only. We don't fund food with RTP unless it's a backcountry crew. So we do have some situations like that where if you've got volunteers or staff going out into the backcountry and have like a per diem or buy food for those events, we can do that. We just don't fund, your volunteer pizza parties and things, which we encourage, but RTP can't be used for that. We can't fund gifts. So if you do gifts for volunteers or staff, can't charge that to RTP or count it as match. We do not fund indirect or overhead costs or count those as match, really just the more direct time that staff are spending on things. And we don't do landscaping projects, but there can be some like mitigation planting that you'll do, especially if you're doing a trail realignment for environmental protection or a new trail construction where you need to replant some disturbed areas. That absolutely you can include as a necessary implementation cost. And we can't count legal fees or pay for them. And lastly, we cannot count the time that you are spending filling out your application. Really, what our budgets are focused on is the project itself, not the good work you're doing to seek funds from different sources for that project, but we just are looking at the project costs themselves. We also can't fund roads with RTP. I know in like the ATV or snowmobile world, there are some designated routes on roads, which that might be treated a little bit differently, but in general, we don't fund roads for vehicular access. And we don't fund maintenance, like I mentioned before. So this would just be your ongoing daily basis or frequent basis kind of work that you do as a land manager or partner. We can fund the restoration and improvement type work, just not the maintenance. And then for the match, like I talked about, you do have to have at least 20% a match within your budget. And that's based on the total project cost. And it has to be necessary for that specific project and directly associated with it. So any kind of cash you can apply. We don't necessarily need to see the source of that. We just, when we see your match, need to see that things are being paid for. We can count your in-kind time that you are contributing to the project or force account. There's no restrictions on what grants you can use to match RTP. There might be restrictions on the other source, like our Land and Water Conservation Fund does have some restrictions, but they can use RTP to match. But RTP as its own, we can count any old grant that you're getting as your match towards this project. Donations we can count. So maybe you have a local trail group that's going to pay for some things directly. We can count that. We'll just need to see it documented. Sometimes vendors might even donate their time or services or actual materials. We can count that too. Just you'll need to document it when it comes time to report your match. And then volunteer labor. We see a lot of volunteer labor on our trail projects. And that's a great way to meet your match or have other contributions included in your budget. So when it comes to volunteer labor, there's two ways that you can value the labor of volunteers. The option one is the easiest and what we recommend for simplicity. The independent sector, that is a national organization. They put out rates, and this is across all types of volunteering. So this isn't just looking at recreation rates, which is why I know some folks think it's pretty high, but it's great. We can use it. Right now, the rate is $36.44 an hour. That's Oregon specific volunteer valuation rate. And usually they update that every April, and then I send out notices to our grantees just when it's time to use the updated rate. And it's only gone up that I've seen. So there's a full report online with the state specific rate, but otherwise you can just use that 36.44 or around a 36.50 on your application because it will go up. And then the second option you have, which this could be a better fit if, say, you only have a few volunteers and maybe they're all heavy equipment operators. So in that case, you can use BOLI rates or Department of Labor rates. The documentation is a little bit more because those rates are set by county and duties and distance to the project site. And those change sometimes more than once a year, so it can be a little more paperwork for that. So again, we recommend option one. We did have a grantee break, attempting to do BOLI a couple years ago, different rates for every single volunteer. And at the end of the day, they were very close to the same valuation if they would just use the 36 or 44, whatever it was at the time. So again, we try to steer folks towards the independent sector for ease for everybody. And we also have a template you can use, or two different versions of a template to track your volunteer time. Real simple, just spreadsheets telling us what they were doing, the dates they worked, and the time that they worked. But if you have your own system that's already in place, it could work to use that. We have a list in our manual of what we need to see on that documentation. And as long as your system covers those things, which they often do that I've seen, then we're good to use what you have. Okay, ownership and public access. And I know we've got a lot of questions coming in, and I will pause in a few slides here just to answer some of those. So we do, for non-federal lands, need to see ownership of the lands. For federal lands, we kind of get that covered in all the NEPA and everything else. So what that typically looks like is just a copy of the deed that you have for the property, that if there are any public use restrictions noted in that, we need to have that highlighted and take a look at that. And then there's also some other, if you have an easement or some other type of use agreement, that can sometimes take the place of a deed, but typically we need to see that. In the grant agreement, the language that is used about public access is that you as the recipient are certifying that that land within that project area will be dedicated and used for a period of no less than 25 years from completion, and that you agree not to take that area out of recreation. So that means if you do have a lease or some other kind of use agreement, it has to go for at least 25 years, or if it's real close, that could be looked at on a case-by-case basis. But we do want to see that these investments are made for the long term. And then as far as public access goes, trails that receive RTP funds need to be open to the general public during reasonable time and hours. So you have to allow access to anybody regardless of demographics. If you say have a trail system that's only open to club members, that's usually not going to fly. We need to see that it's open to the general public. Although you are still allowed to charge user fees. I know this was, I guess, a point of confusion for quite a few years, but there's nothing about receiving RTP funds that would restrict you from charging your normal user fees that you determine and apply through your normal use fee process as a public agency. But with that public access, land managers still maintain their discretionary responsibilities. So we know that a lot of these trails are going to be closed for a while during fire season. There are trails like the one in the picture on the screen, that's Cascade Head, and some of those trails are closed for half of the year due to wildlife restriction. That is fine. That doesn't stop you from getting RTP, but that's just good information that we should know up front about what those restrictions will be. But that is your normal management still applies. You just have to make your project open to the public or keep it that way. Let's actually, before we go on, I'm actually going to pause for questions here. There's a question about road right of way. That sounds like a question you should email me about, Kevin. If you could send me more information, it's about if there's no road built, does that fall into transportation? But yeah, I'd like to know a little bit more about that before giving you an answer. Someone's asking if you can have both a motorized and a non-motorized project funded simultaneously. So yes, if say you're a land manager or partner and you have a project on an ATV trail system, you also have a project on a mountain bike trail system, you can submit more than one application. And in that case, it'd be one application under each of those categories. But if you do have a project that allows both motorized and non-motorized use, which we have funded some of those over the years, that's something to get a hold of me about, and I can take a closer look at what would be the most appropriate category to compete under. Someone is asking about a county parks property that restricts entry to organized educational groups only. I would want to see more about that one too. If it's not open to the general public, that doesn't sound like it would be a fit, but I'd still be happy to take a look at that and see if it's something we could work with. And then there's somebody with a summer camp that doesn't allow open access. So same, you would have to, that area has to be open to the general public for use. If it's a trail system that is periodically closed for a day here and there or a little bit of time to host a summer camp, that could be fine. But if it's a trail system that's just entirely only open to a camp, then no, that would not be eligible. And then as far as water trails, if motorized boats are allowed on the water trail, does it become motorized? So it's a good question. Typically in the world of water trails, they're treated and thought of more as non-motorized facilities but just like so the Willamette River Trail, we have funded some camping facilities for paddlers and things like that. And that has been under the non-motorized category, even though motorized boats do use that river as well. So it's more about what's the use and intent of the facility that you're putting in with RTP. There's not a lot in just nationally in the larger RTP network. There's not many states that use motorized funds for boating access because there's a separate gas tax fund for motorized boating facilities that the Marine Board works with here in Oregon. So we'd want to look a little bit at if this is really for motorized use, is RTP the best fit? But there can be some gray area in there. So sorry, I keep saying to contact me, but that sounds like something I should take a closer look at. And then as far as the county opportunity grants, just going back to that, that has to be county owned and operated to be eligible for that program. So if say county wants to apply on behalf of a city owned campground, then that probably wouldn't be a good fit. But you could contact our other grant coordinators about that. And then after somebody's asking about the LOI process, yep, I'll get a little bit more into that, but I'll answer this in the meantime. Just when are you notified when you are approved or denied for your letter of intent and be able to submit a full proposal? And then can the application questions be viewed before this? So one is I usually get to the letter of intent approvals pretty quickly. I am working fairly normally in September, so I should be able to approve those or contact you with questions pretty quick. And as far as the application questions, we do have a Word document on our website right now. And Naomi, actually, if you could bop in the chat just the link to the RTP section of our website, there's an application section when you get there, and there's a Word document. We always make that available, and especially are leading people to that this year since our application can't be seen yet. But yeah, and you can use that Word document to back up all your answers and everything else. So good questions. Thanks, folks. Okay, so we're going to get into the environmental review. And just again, another reminder that this is recorded. You'll get a copy of these slides, so you'll be able to refer to all this, and it'll be on our website. So as a federally funded program, all projects are reviewed for their environmental impacts and to ensure any necessary approvals in place. So RTP falls under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA for RTP is going to look different than NEPA looks for U.S. Forest Service a little bit, but in general, we fall under those requirements and have process to show compliance with NEPA. And the review process is very different and documentation too is very different for federal versus non-federal land. This also, if you are just doing safety and education or just doing equipment purchase, none of this is going to apply to you. This only applies if you are doing any on-the-ground work or disturbing any ground, whether you're putting in a signpost or building a brand new trail. Oh, and there is, actually, no, this is on the next slide. Actually, I'll say it here. For if you're with a tribal government, the requirements are going to apply a little bit differently because as we'll walk through this, you'll see there's for the non-federal lands, there's certain consultation they do or that we do with SHPO or with state agencies. And in general, for tribal governments, we'll defer to your natural resource office and your cultural resource office, but that's something I can help you walk through just about what's required that we'll need. So if you are the federal land manager, we need your NEPA documentation so that, the level of NEPA review is up to your agency. Of course, if your project is considered a categorical exclusion or, BLM land, you use the DNA acronym. We just need documentation of that. But if you need full-on NEPA review or different levels of that, we need a copy of the signed decision memo. And if you had to do a full-on environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, we also need a copy of that. So just give us all your NEPA documentation. And then as far as Section 106 goes, or cultural resource review, for our federal land managers, we need documentation of that. And that's going to look different, I know, between Forest Service and BLM, and might look different even forest to forest. Most forests, if unless the project requires further SHPO or tribal consultation, we usually get a copy of a heritage review form that essentially has your archaeologist checking off that the project doesn't require any further review, and we would just need that submitted to us. But sometimes that's going to look different. Sometimes it's a memo, sometimes that's lumped in with the NEPA documentation, but one way or another, we just need a copy of that. NEPA, we won't even move your application forward to the committee without it early next year. Section 106, we can wait for that, but you should get started on that because I know that can sometimes take a long time for whether it's scheduling or the level of review that's needed. And now for non-federal land. So any of your construction projects or any ground disturbance, if it's included, you'll need to complete the RTP environmental screening form, and then you will need to consult with certain state agencies. And like I said, for tribes, this is going to apply a little differently. And if you shoot me an email, I can outline what exactly you'll need to submit in place of these things. And there are instructions in our manual about this. I know this part can seem a little bit daunting if you haven't applied before. Again, we're here to help and walk you through what this looks like. So for the state agency consultation, so all projects on non-federal land except for tribes have to consult with Department of State Lands, Department of Oregon Fish and Wildlife, and Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. So you'll send off information about your project and they'll comment back to you or not. And then there's some other agencies you may need to consult with if any boating is involved, or if you're working on a trail that's adjacent to a boat ramp or could have impacts to it. Contact the State Marine Board, and if you don't, then I will ask you to later on in the process. There also might be reasons you need to contact Department of Forestry, ODOT, and Agriculture. And we have a contact list that provides more information about what would trigger contacting those agencies. And what the purpose of this is they may come back with comments about changes to your project that need to happen, improvements to the project, or just other comments for improving things and protecting natural resources in the project area. So the first step to do the state agency review is to complete the RTP environmental screening form to the best of your ability. You might not know every answer to every question on there, but do it to the best you can. Then you'll fill out a transmittal memo, or this could be an email in its place. You will fill out this consultation form that we provide a template of, and you will email that to each of those agencies. So you'll include your review form that they'll comment on or fill out. You'll include your environmental screening form that provides information about what you've already assessed as far as environmental impacts. Include a map and a site plan so that they know what they're looking at. And then once you do that, they have 30 days to respond. Please respect their time. They've already been given a heads up that this information has gone out. We have an open grant cycle. They've been reminded that they have 30 days. I know sometimes applicants will ask for a quicker turnaround, but our agreement with them is that they have that full 30 days. And they may also come back to you and say, I need more information. I don't understand this project. I need more detail on this to actually assess it. So just, make sure to get back to them. And if they need more time, that's totally fine. Because I do realize some folks don't start this step until later in the process, even though ideally you'd start it earlier on. But if you submit your application and you don't have a response from them yet, that's fine. There's a place on the application where you'll communicate that to me, and then you can send those into me, or we'll collect those later on in the process. And also make sure to read their comments. Sometimes their comments could really impact your project or your budget, or maybe you need to do a wetland delineation and you're not planning for that. or maybe the placement of your restroom is not going to work and you'll need to move it. So make sure to read those. It's not just a thing to get the form filled out and send it into me, but you need to take those comments into account if they have any. A lot of times they'll say no comment or depending on the project, but if they do, make sure that you take that into account. And if you have questions about it, by all means, go back to them and ask for more help or information, understanding what they've responded to you. So yeah, like I said, on the application, it'll ask if you're still waiting to hear back from any agencies and who those are. And then we also have a question about if they commented to you, those agencies or the land use jurisdiction, what is your response to that? What have you taken into account in your project plan and budget to respond to those? And now I'm going to talk a little bit about a newer process and requirement as of the last year. So in addition to you asking for comment from the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Department, we as administering a federally funded program also have to consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife because they each oversee the different, whether it's a state or federally listed species. Of course, there's going to be overlap in their responses, but we do have to go to Fish and Wildlife. So what this means for you is that if you're working on non-federal land, you'll have to run an IPAC report. That stands for Information for Planning and Consultation. So you'll get a link to this. There are links to this website in the application attachment checklist, as well as in the slides you'll get from me. So you'll go into this system. You'll pick your project area, and then you'll upload a copy of the report, which lists all the species that are in your area, or I think it's by county. It's good to look at that before you finalize and attach your RTP environmental screening form, because the screening form asks about, are there any threatened and endangered species in the project area? And if so, what impacts do you anticipate, et cetera? Just what you think might be the impacts, because there'll be more follow-up later on. And then what we're doing with U.S. Fish and Wildlife is we have an informal consultation meeting that I'll do sometime this winter, just to lightly go through projects and get a heads up about any potential issues that they see. And then if you are selected for funding, then we do more formal consultation with them after the grant meeting. And that's when they might have even more questions or need more information from you about, what type of equipment are you using and what months do you plan to do this work? Do you know if there's a nest in this park, et cetera? So yeah, you'll run the report and then you'll upload it to the application. In the links that I share, it goes right to this page, but if you were to just Google IPAC, get to their page, there is an option to log in, but if you're just running this report for application purposes, you do not need to register with them for an account. You can just go right to the map. So once you are in the map, you will either create a polygon shape or upload a shape file, which you can do, and even more exact about where your project area is. And then you will print the resource list, which will allow you to save it as a PDF, and then you can upload it to your application. And again, we'll go through that with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and there'll be some back and forth later on in the process if you're selected for funding. But again, this is only for construction projects on non-federal land. And then for non-federal lands, for cultural resource review, and again, for tribes that apply, you'll go to your TIPO, but here we'll just talk about the other local governments, state governments, et cetera. So if you've applied in the past or applied to our other programs, you've been asked to fill out some SHPO forms, or the State Historic Preservation Office. We no longer collect those up front for RTP, but instead there's a section on the environmental screening form that asks about any known historic or cultural resources within the project area and any anticipated impacts to those. So you'll fill out the environmental screening form, and then later on in the process, Federal Highways and I will work together to get all the funded projects off to SHPO for their review. One thing that has changed too in the last couple of years is that if there has not been a cultural resource survey in your project area, it is almost guaranteed that you're going to have to do one. One nice thing is we do have an archaeologist working for Federal Highways that has access to the database that is a protected database, not open to the public, but they can look up to see if there's been a survey if you're not sure. And then what we'll do is encourage you to budget for a survey as pre-agreement match, because you will have to pay for that, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide. So if Federal Highway is a tribe or SHIP will request a survey, which again is almost guaranteed upfront with Federal Highways, you will have to pay for that yourself, because it has to be done prior to us giving notice to proceed. So you can count that as pre-agreement match. We cannot reimburse it. However, if through this consultation it's decided that it's best to have a monitor on site, like is shown in this picture where one of our staff archaeologists is out there monitoring a dig that's going on, that's something, if it's during implementation, that we can include in the budget. But I will be flagging this for you as well, when I'm reviewing applications. And then Federal Highways, they are responsible to consult with tribes, as a federal agency. So they will consult with tribes after we know which projects are funded. And that could also request in questions, ask for more information, maybe modifications if there's something concerning in that area, et cetera. And then in all of our agreements, and as you are hopefully using for any projects, we have an inadvertent discovery plan, which essentially outlines what to do if you do find something as you're working, which again, hopefully with having that survey up front, that gets ahead of a lot of that. Let's see. So another pause for questions, which I don't see any. So I am going to go on to the next one. And again, thanks for hanging in. I know this is a lot, but hopefully this will be just helpful, even more to reference back to. Okay, so the application process. So the link that Naomi shared to our website, the RTP page, you'll see this application and forms section. This has a lot of the information. You'll need pretty much most of it. So there's well, this is an old screenshot, but you'll see the 2025 application worksheet. That's the Word document I refer to, that has a list of all of the questions. So just good practice in general to use that, to save a backup copy of your responses, but also helpful just to prepare things as we wait for our online application to get fixed. And then once you are in the application itself, and if you've applied before, you've seen this, all of these same forms and instructions are uploaded to the application so that as you're filling out the application, you can just easily go down and click on those for easy reference. So we've got the grant manual, detailed instructions for just using our system. The other one important thing I want to call out is this application attachment worksheet. This lists out the different requirements for non-federal versus federal land, and then at the bottom, the abbreviated version for what we would need if for like safety and education and equipment proposals that don't necessarily need all of that detail. So once you are in, so on our website, you go to our OPRD grants website. If you have an existing account, you just use the sign in up top right. If you don't have an account, you will request one. I do know some of you have requested accounts that I haven't gotten through yet, but hopefully I'll get caught up on those soon. And when you request an account, you select the organization that you work for, and or volunteer with, or however you're associated. But if your organization is not in that list, so if your organization has never applied to our programs, you'll enter the name of your organization, and then I may contact you with some questions before I get you set up. Oh, and sometimes folks will have consultants, or maybe your volunteer or have volunteers working with you. So if I get, if it's City of Sherman and I get a request from a volunteer to have access, I'm going to ask, I need official documentation from the city saying that we can give you access, because that consultant or volunteer will have access to all of your reports and records associated with your OPRD grants history. And once you're in there, once everything is fixed, you will see that you can pick either the motorized or non-motorized application here. This will be September 30th, 2025, unless we push that out sooner than later. If you do work with or for multiple organizations, you will see those all listed here. So we have some folks that maybe they work for the city, but they also help their local foundation apply for grants. So just make sure when you're getting started to pick an application that you're under the proper organization that is the one intending to apply for the grant. And then there's the letter of intent. These questions are also in that application worksheet Word document that you can find if you want to prepare it in the meantime. But really the purpose of this is for high-level screening of, is your project eligible? Are there any issues that we see? You don't need to sell your project to me. This is really just for me to do that quick screening. So just tell me what the project is, where it is, and then about how much you think you will request. So it doesn't even allow, I think, more than about 225 characters. So again, you don't need to write a big narrative about the why, but just tell me what it is so I can tell if it's eligible. And then you'll save and submit your letter of intent. And then once I approve it, when you go back to that application, you will see the full application and all the questions on it. So there's a number of sections that the application's broken into that I will go over. This year, I also added a lot of guidance on the application itself to help applicants even more understand what we're asking. So a few pointers: use Chrome or Firefox if you're using Edge or whatever else is out there these days. Those have problems with our website. So Chrome or Firefox are best. We have a lot of instructions in the manual, so keep those handy, as well as those online application instructions. Save often when you're in the application. There is an autosave function that I know can get a little annoying even, but even without that, just save often. And then keep a backup copy of your responses. So that worksheet can be a great place just to type out your responses to copy and paste into the application. And then you have a copy if anything goes really, really awry with our website. And if you're a nonprofit partner working with a land manager, make sure to review everything with them so that you're on the same page about what you are committing to. These are some things just to get started on early if you're not already started. So again, federal lands, have your NEPA and Section 106 in process if not already done. For non-federal lands, that's just a list of the things we recommend getting started on early because they require an external person to respond to and comment on. And then for everyone, requesting letters of support, which we'll talk more about. Give folks time to do that so that you can get some good letters for the committee to showcase that support. And then you'll also need a land manager approval form, which I know can take time depending on what channels those have to go through at the land manager. And that's required for everybody, whether or not you're a nonprofit. Also, just as you're filling out your application, as I've already indicated, whatever you're committing to is what you will have to do if you get a grant. So make sure your scope and budget are realistic, because when we go to close out these grants, we are holding you to that and need to see that that work has been done. For projects that are still in the planning stage, really, when you're coming to our programs that fund these construction projects, unless you're coming in for an assessment, really that planning should be pretty far, if not all the way done, before you come to us. As you're filling out the application, just know your audience. I always use the comparison of, Travel Oregon can sometimes fund the same exact projects, but when you go to Travel Oregon, you're going to write about the tourism, economic benefits of that project. And when you come to us, you'll focus more on the recreational aspects of it. So often plenty of overlap between all these different funding sources, but just keep that in mind about who you're talking to, because different funders might want to hear different information. Be very clear and concise for reviewers. Our committee members do such great hard work reviewing so many applications, and it's so very important just to be very clear and direct and concise with them in your responses. And then don't assume that staff and committee members know your perk system. Our committee members, which I'll mention later, they represent different user groups. They also represent different areas of the state. So not everybody might know your park, even though in your community, everybody knows what you're talking about. You don't necessarily need to explain to us why trails are important. That's why we're all here. That's why our committees do this great work. We all know that trails are great and do great things for health and the economy, which there are some questions about that. But in general, our committee members are pretty knowledgeable just about general benefits of these things, but they don't necessarily know what your community and what your users need who use that system. I'm going to talk a little bit about AI, which I know is a very, very, very helpful tool for our folks. It's, becoming even more helpful for folks doing grant writing and proofreading, and that is great. And I'm sure, most of the time we don't even know it's being used because it's helpful and it is improving folks' writing skills in some places. But I do want to just mention a couple pitfalls we have noticed, just to keep in mind if you are going to rely on AI. There have been some instances where it is just pulling in a totally incorrect response. There are some areas where you'll need to refer to tables in our manual, different data points from the statewide trails plan. And we did notice that in some cases, in another grants program, that it was actually just pulling in wrong information. Or we see responses that don't necessarily answer the question, or maybe all they do is define the question but don't answer it. So look out for that. Answers that get buried. Again, our reviewers are reviewing a lot of information, so just be very clear and concise. And I know some tools sometimes can add just a lot of what folks might consider fluff. So just be clear, be concise. We have also seen some folks just include references to an AI tool pasted into their response. So look out for that. If we see ChatGPT mentioned everywhere, that could impact how the committee members look at the application. But again, it's great. It can be a great tool for you. And then we've also seen inaccurate information. So actually creep into scopes. So we want your scope to be written as the actual deliverables, because again, the humans in this group are the ones who are planning the project. And AI can be helpful for your grammar, your writing, but only you know your deliverables. So one of, or just a few takeaways, have some humans proofreading this. And then just, as a respect to your community, make sure you're submitting accurate information, and also just respecting time of staff and committee members who may have to go through some of this information. And we're having to look at things a little bit differently than we have. But again, we know it's a great tool for grant writing. And yes, there's somebody in the chat who says they basically have a seminar written on the ethical use of AI in grant writing. But yes, I'm sure we'll keep seeing more about this at conferences for years to come. Okay, so jumping now into just some of the straightforward information we'll need. There's a contact information section. You'll select who the primary contact is, but just know that anybody associated with your organization has the same level of access as far as being able to fill out, edit, and submit an application. If you notice that your contact information that you're selecting on the application isn't correct, maybe your phone number or your address changed, you can't edit it in the application itself, but you can edit it on the home screen. So just come back here to reference if that applies to you. For all applicants, when it comes time to award grants, we need your unique entity ID and your federal tax ID. So if you're not already familiar with the UEI, that is the ID number required for anyone receiving federal funds or any organization. So if you had a DUNS number, if that sounds familiar, then the UEI would have just automatically replaced that. But if you don't have one, I recommend getting started on this quick. I know some folks, especially small nonprofits with PO boxes and things, have had trouble getting through this process. So if you're a nonprofit, then get started. But I would assume if you're with a public agency that you have one, and your accountants or procurement folks would be able to tell you. There on the application, you'll fill out a project name. This actually carries over from the letter of intent, but you can change it. Be short but specific enough for us. So maybe the name of the trail, the name of the trail system, not just mountain bike project, but actually say the name of it. And then you'll enter a brief project description. And this should just be your deliverables. And on the right, you can reference that later, but those are some examples of some just really straightforward project descriptions that we like to see. That's not the place for making a case. There's plenty of other spaces in the application to do that. But this is really, if you can imagine, when people want to see where their taxpayer dollars are going to, this is the kind of information we provide. So this goes into reports, your grant agreement, etc. Just really straightforward. Then on the application, you will select the start and end dates. And this is I know you won't necessarily know your start date because that's based on when you'll get your grant, but you can anticipate that'll be probably safest to say fall 2026, possibly summer, but probably earliest it would be fall. You'll put the name and everything of your site, a description of the site, and then you'll select a location. Folks have had trouble with this lat long tool that's in the application, but there are some tips in the online application instructions that are attached to the application. Next, I'll go over the project budget worksheet. With the budget, you do need to be specific enough that it's clear to reviewers what expenses are included in your scope and show that you have a well thought out budget. There isn't like a standard level of detail just because your projects can be so different. But do your best. And then if I need more information when I'm reviewing it, I will let you know. And then once your project starts, think numbers can usually deviate. This might be different in other grant programs though, that you work with or at our agency. But so if you budgeted an amount for materials and one amount for contractors, and that needs to slightly deviate within like more or less on one of those, that's typically fine for us. But those are things we can go over if needed. So when you're in the application, on the bottom right here, there's the add worksheet item. That's where you will just start putting in line by line what your different expenses are. And then at the top, you can see this will just autofill with your grant amount, match, and your percentages. So that's where you can watch, just double check that your match is at the minimum 20%. So when you enter your line items, you'll enter what that is. So in this example, I'm actually showing something that doesn't have a cost, but a valuation. So volunteer labor, you'll put in the quantity. So in this case, this would be hours and what that unit is, and then the cost per unit. When you have match, you check off this match box and then you put in what the amount is. So if it's say a contract where you're going to pay half and half cash, and then the other half RTP, you would just put in half of that amount here. For something like volunteer labor, you would just run the numbers and then put in what that total is, since that will be fully 100% match. And then if there is funding associated with it, here I just put the name of the volunteer group, but if there's funding, you'll put that in here. So here's just a couple other examples of how to enter match. So in this case, agency budgeted funds. And then on the right example, this is an example if you have another grant contributing in your budget, you would enter all that information here. So question about phasing. That's a great question. So if you are looking for, say, phase 2 funding for a project, we can't count phase 1 if that was a construction project. The only thing we can count as match that would be pre-agreement are those planning costs that I mentioned. So final planning, final design, but we can't count previous work that you've done on that trail or trail system. So again, you can watch your budget as you populate it line by line to make sure it meets the 20%. Another thing we sometimes see is in the RTP request column of your budget, a negative amount. So just something to watch for, because that means there's some math that needs to be fixed. A few other tips. Brands, vendors, or contractors should not be named unless you have an existing agreement. So if you know what brand you like, but if it's above a certain threshold for doing a procurement, then you don't name that brand, because you'll have to go out and get quotes and have a competitive procurement process. Same with vendors or contractors. But if you have existing price agreements or something already in place with those type of vendors, then you can name them. But those are questions that I'm going to ask you in technical review if I see those called out. And then include all the items that are in your grant or match as far as the RTP budget. So labor, equipment, materials, anything else that is going to be included in your grant or match. But if you have things like maybe you did an accessibility assessment 2 years ago, you're not going to count that as match. Don't put that in the budget, but there will be a place in the application. You'll talk about your assessment of accessibility. So it should just be your match and grant items for RTP. And then, like I already said, make sure to factor in inflation and contingency into those specific line items, not as their own, but make sure to factor that in as you're thinking about what those things might cost in a year or more from now when you get your notice to proceed. You'll select your project category, so things those categories like new construction versus restoration versus equipment. You'll select the different trail user groups, and then we do have a question on the non-motorized application about e-bikes. That's mainly for my reporting purposes to federal highways. So you can just put a short description of whether or not you allow e-bikes on that trail that's otherwise non-motorized. And then you'll put in information about status of any pending environmental or cultural review. And now I will just go into the scoring criteria. I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'm just, again, you can come back to these slides and reference them for help as you're going through the criteria. But in short, there are these different categories that the committee will score your project on. Totals 105, and so each project, the average score of the committees make up your score. So each committee member puts in their scores, and then those all get averaged to come up with your score, and then the projects are ranked within that order. And there's a lot of detail that's not included in this on these slides that you can find in the manual about how best to answer some of these questions. Or of course, you can call or email me if you're not sure. We also have a committee scoring rubric in the manual. It's at the end of it in Appendix E. This is a tool that they worked with me to develop a few years back to give an idea of how the committee members score, but a lot of this actually was integrated onto the application itself, so which I hope that helps. And there are some out-of-date page numbers on here, but just a quick disclaimer. So I do a technical review up front. So what we're looking for, one is whether you're on track with active grants or if there's any major issues going on. If you've got some projects that have been delayed, that's not necessarily an issue, but if there's some serious things going on, that could be cause for denial or special conditions to be put on the grant. And then I'm mainly looking at, is this an eligible project? Does it, meet the intent of RTP? Is everything eligible? Is everything complete? Does everything align? And would you be ready to proceed if you got the grant? Then the committee will score your scope, but really this is written sort of for two different purposes. So for the committee, they're understanding the proposal, and then making sure that this is a project that also is ready to go as sort of an added layer of readiness, and that it's a well-planned and thought out project. But also for OPRD, some other purposes are, up front, we're looking at this to make sure the project is eligible and ready. And then when the project is done, we're going back to this to make sure everything is done. So there's a variety of questions on here. I'm just going to skip over these and you can refer back to these if you're not sure how to answer some of those scope questions, but they're pretty straightforward. And they do include some questions about accessibility, both, what is accessible of the project, how did you assess that, and then any, adjacent facilities and the accessibility of those. I do want to just pause and mention that, a big part of the Architectural Barriers Act and a big part of what we consistently hear in public surveys and from advocates is the need for better and more information about the trail itself and the specifications of it. And so the ABA lists out kind of the minimum requirements for what should be on trailheads, signage, and online information. And I know land managers and us, we have a lot of work to do in this space. So we encourage you, if you are doing a construction or restoration proposal, that you are including signage in it. And this is just an example on the left here. And then on the right is a resource developed by Access Recreation, really great group in Oregon, who's done a lot of good work in this space for providing best practices and minimum requirements for those things. So make sure to be thinking about that. The next category is youth conservation or service corps. This was updated and clarified this year. There was some misalignment we had with some of the wording in the federal guidance. So that's been updated and is on the application. We know that not every project is going to be appropriate to have a youth corps involved, but Federal Highways does encourage states to award extra points, which is why a lot of states do this. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if you don't have one involved. It's just sort of bonus points for projects where it makes sense to have a youth corps involved. And there are certain youth corps that are part of what's called the core network. And this is a screenshot of their website that lists out what those quote qualified youth corps are in every state. And one of the benefits of this and through the connection with federal highways is that you can sole source those youth corps, meaning you don't necessarily need to go through a procurement process unless your agency otherwise requires. So you can, if you want to reach out to them, think about their role in the project and including funding for them in the budget. That's absolutely something you can plan ahead and name them as a group because you can sole source contract with those. I'm going to go a little bit fast over some of these scoring sections again so that you can come back and refer to these. We have a question about benefits for more of your tourist destination dispersed projects. You can focus on economic benefits of the project and community trails. You can focus on health benefits, and of course, you can focus on both if you'd like to. And there's a lot of like leading questions in the grant manual to help you think about how best to frame your response. Then the biggest category is issues and needs. So this is to award points to projects that meet statewide, regional, and or your locally identified needs. So the application has two questions. First is how does the project meet the statewide and regional issues? And so we have those handy in the appendix of the manual. That's from our statewide trails plan. We're working on updating the next one, but it's they're pretty general issues and needs, and I'd say most projects fit pretty well within what we have. But either way, whether or not your project fits within those statewide and regional needs, we also want to hear how does the project satisfy your locally identified needs. So through your master plan, what you've done in your community and with your user groups, we want to hear how it meets those needs. And this is an and or. So again, if it doesn't meet the statewide need, but you've got strong case for and documentation of how it meets your local needs, that can be just as strong. And of course, for projects that don't trigger a public input process, you could look at how does this work fit within the management plan or goals of a master plan that was developed maybe years ago. So yeah, go to the manual to get some ideas on that. And then to go a little bit deeper from those somewhat general statewide issues and needs, we go into user needs. So this is to talk about a little bit more about the project plan and design and use and how that really satisfies needs of intended user groups. So there's a lot of different ways you can approach this and a lot of ideas in the manual of what to talk about for this one. And then there's public support. So this is sort of twofold. One thing we ask is that you upload to the application at least 5 letters of support. You're not denied if you only have 4 or less, but this does make a big difference in your points, and the content of these letters can also just help make an overall case. So with these, give folks time to write these letters, give them background. I know it's helpful. Just kind of jumping to the end there where form letters, those can be a little less helpful if the committee opens up and all the letters say the exact same thing, just with a different signature. That's not going to be as strong, but I know that's just kind of how things often operate. So try to take the time to work with folks, give them some background, maybe a few bullet points, and then help them put things into their own words, because these can be very, very impactful to your score. And then we do recommend you put them all in one attachment, maybe with a cover sheet to list them out, just again, to save our committee members from all that clicking if you upload them separately. And we really want these from users and community groups. I know it can be really easy to get letters from public agencies, politicians, maybe businesses that don't necessarily have a stake in the recreation economy in your area. Those I know they're easy, they can be good, but focus on getting at least 5 from users and community groups, and just have those public agencies be in addition to your user letters. And then also in the application, we ask about public support because the letters of support may not capture all the great work you did in your community doing big meetings and outreach at events, etc. So we know this won't apply to every project, but this is a space where you can provide information just about any other efforts you have going on besides just the collection of letters. Then we want to hear about the maintenance and management of your trail systems. This is always the biggest need that we hear about for every land manager and partner and user across the state. And we want to make sure that our investments will be maintained and that you've got systems in place, whether at your agency or through all the different partners that you have. So you can describe things like staffing and budget or partnerships and just how you'll care for the trails moving forward. We also ask about environmental and design sustainability. There's some straightforward guidance in the manual you can refer to on this. And there are some ideas too about how you can answer this if you don't have a construction proposal, but there's still some ways you can frame it. And then we ask about social sustainability. So projects that will foster some sort of connectedness or make a public space in the community or foster more partnerships. So more ideas to refer back to here. And then the committee can award up to 5 points for urgent projects. So not every project is going to have an urgent need, but we certainly see some every year that maybe there was a wildfire or a bridge is unsafe or burned down, things like that. So just telling us why you need funds now and what the consequences are if you weren't to get funded with RTP. Then there's the fiscal considerations. So we want to see, or the committee will award points if you are demonstrating a strong financial need, maybe good funding approach and partnerships in place, and a good strategy moving forward. So there's some questions you will answer there. And if you are asking for over that $200,000 recommended max, you can make your case there. And for nonprofits, definitely coordinate this with the land manager and let me know if you have questions about how best to do that. Then we have diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you can talk about what your agency or organization does in this space to reduce barriers to the outdoors and create more welcoming spaces. And then anything specifically in your project, if that applies, that is sort of part of those efforts to reduce barriers and be more welcoming. In our newest SCORP, there's some really, really great recommended actions for recreation providers on reducing barriers to the outdoors. I'd encourage you to take a look at that if you need some ideas, because there's a lot I think that folks are doing that this could sort of frame in that way of the good work you're doing and what more you could do if you do need ideas for just strategy in general. So check that out if you need a resource. And then our committee members award up to 15 points for each project for anything else as discretionary points. So really looking at those projects that really blow them out of the water. There's some really strong partnerships, or it's a really important trail or community that really needs to be served that maybe hasn't been served or doesn't have a lot of trail access. So that is just up to them to decide how they're going to award those points. Then we go into some questions. These are not scored questions, but just to get to know your organization a little bit more and paint your picture a little more. So just about your performance, just general performance with our grants. This organizational structure, this has been helpful for the committee and is something they asked, especially wanting to better understand certain government entities about kind of who manages what, as well as nonprofits and understanding their role with the land manager, their partnership. And then there's a couple more questions. There's a few more financial questions about pre-agreement costs. Again, if you don't have financial capacity for reimbursement-based grants, that's your space to tell me that, and then I'll follow up. And then we have a new question about prevailing wages that we put on there, and this is in response to some updated language in our grant agreement, but there's more information in the application about that. As you go to upload attachments, so all these categories of attachments are all required, and your goal is to upload something under each of them, hopefully the right thing with the right information on it, until you see this green checkbox, which means you've uploaded everything you need. On this application attachment checklist that I have uploaded, you'll see that not all these forms apply to you. Like, for example, the land use form does not apply to federal agencies. And in that case, you do need to upload something. So what we recommend is a Word document or PDF just marked as not applicable. And you can just upload that in place. That's just the way the system functions. We already talked a little bit about getting started on your attachments early, or at least getting a grip on what you'll have to fill out, what you'll have to complete, so you can work that into your workload and meet the deadline. Everything you upload should be very clear to staff and committee members. So using cover sheets, captions, and notations are really helpful. And then, like I mentioned, with the letters of support, anywhere that you can combine documents into one file. So like maybe it's mapping documents or different site plan documents, you can combine those into one PDF, and that's very helpful for our reviewers. There's three different types of maps you'll need to upload. There's a vicinity map, which I'll show on the next slide, a park boundary map, so a map of the park or of the trail system, depending. Um, Ooh, good question about prevailing wage. Thank you. I will stop for a second and answer that. So no, RTP is exempt from Davis-Bacon unless the project falls within the road right of way of a federal aid highway. State prevailing wages, though, however, those may still apply to the project, but that's going to be a little nuanced to the land manager and grant recipient. So this is more just about the state, and there is a note about the Davis-Bacon not applying on the application. Okay. And so yeah, then after the park boundary map, you'll upload site plans. I don't believe there's a size constraint. I see a question about that on what you can upload, but if you do run into issues, try to email that to me or I can take a look at what the issue might be, or figure out a way to split it up. Um, and so on the site plan, we want that to be so very clear because this is used by those agencies you're consulting with. They're used by us to understand the project and also to close the grant out. So we need to see all these things, and we need to be really clear to our committee about what all is in here, because everything in here should align with your scope and your budget. So just note everything very, very clearly. Use all these arrows and captions wherever you can. So it's when we look at it, we know exactly what it is. You might have engineering plans and you can include those too when it's relevant. But usually an engineering plan doesn't necessarily have as clear of information just to understand the bigger picture about the project. So here's just an example you can refer back to of a vicinity map. So really it's looking where are we in the state? It could be a little pop out of the region or like this one where it was close to Portland, so easy to call out. So come back to this if you need an example. Already talked a little bit about property ownership. We need your deed or something showing that it's owned by the public agency and open to the public. And if there's multiple interests or multiple tax lots, it's helpful to submit a map so we can tie which deed is for which tax lot. You'll also need, this is for non-federal lands, actually both of these, a land use compatibility statement. So we have a form available in the application. If you're within a UGB, you'll send that to your city planning office. If you're outside of the urban growth boundary, you'll send that to your county planning office. And they're reviewing your project to make sure it complies with or is compatible with the land use zoning, or in whether any permits might be needed, like a conditional use permit, or maybe just like a building permit. That's a simple permit that you need to get later on. If we see that a conditional use permit is needed, definitely describe that in the application under the appropriate question. And depending on the situation, we may hold your notice to proceed until you have that conditional use permit in hand. And that's sort of case by case depending on the situation. And if there are anticipated appeals or you've already got some constituents who are going to fight this, it's helpful to be forthcoming with us about that. Okay, then you'll need a land manager approval form. If you're just buying equipment, it may just be a letter of support would suffice in that case because there's no construction involved. You'll need to submit a timeline. We have a template, or you can use your own. And then you'll have the opportunity to upload all these other attachments. So photos, your NEPA documentation, your IPAC report. There is an accessibility memo we need completed if it is a trail primarily designed for hiking, because that's where these specific ABA requirements come into play. So you'll fill that out. And that can get a little confusing about when it applies. So don't hesitate to ask me if you're not sure. And then anything else you want to apply, there is an other category in the application. You can upload things as long as they're really clear about what we're looking at and how it supports the application package. And these are just some examples of photos you can refer back to. It's very much recommended that you put those into a document and add captions to them so we know what we're looking at versus individually uploading a bunch of files without explanation. So this can be a good way just to showcase the need for your funding, as well as maybe like the great views that trail users will get in the area. So applications, at least as it stands now, unless the system issues go on much longer, they'll be due November 15th. I believe that does fall on a weekend, so of course just plan ahead with your workload. The online system won't allow you to submit until everything is answered and all the attachments are uploaded. Try to get done early, a little bit earlier, of course, and get in touch with me. If there are any technical issues, just get a hold of me and I'll work with you to work those out. Every year there's a batch of folks where something happens in the system and we need to work with them to get it submitted, even if it's a couple days later. So please don't hesitate to reach out if something like that happens to you, but try to get it in early is always the best. And then the committee will come and meet in March. If you are requesting more than $50,000, you will be required to give a presentation to them. And these are public meetings that we hold hybrid. So there's in-person and Zoom. Most people seem to, at least for RTP, have been going the Zoom route. It doesn't make a difference if you choose to do that, but you'll have 20 minutes to both present and answer any questions of them. And actually, just to go back, once we actually get those dates nailed down after the application deadline, you'll get more information and then have an opportunity to sign up for a presentation time. All right, and we've got 10 minutes. I think I've answered all the questions, so I'm just going to run through a little bit more, but feel free to pop questions in if anything else is coming to mind. And of course, get a hold of me after this if you need.
Hey Jody, there's just one question in the chat
Yeah.
about Matt.
Okay, and I think I actually got that one. That was the one about phasing. So if you can use phase one to match phase two, but really we can't count anything as match if it was construction. So Shelly, feel free to get a hold of me if we need to get more in the weeds on that one. This is who our committee is made up of, or at least their positions. So again, they represent all types of trail interest groups, trail users. Fantastic group of experts that bring a lot of great perspective. We also do have our federal agencies represented as non-voting members for the time being, at least. And we give them your applications at least 1 month prior to the meeting. So they are spending their time digging in, looking at all your maps, looking at your photos, and trying to get a better idea of your project, as well as maybe coming up with questions that they want to ask you at the meeting. And just because the question does come up, we do at times have folks on our committees that work for a land manager or work for an eligible nonprofit, and they do recuse from scoring applications if it's one of those entities that they're associated with. And these are just tips for the grant meeting. I'll leave here for reference, but this will all come out to you in an email closer to the meeting date. So again, the committee will meet in March. Our commission will vote whether to approve those project recommendations in April. And then there's just a lot of stuff that happens. So working with Federal Highways, working with ODOT, sending things through our Department of Justice for review, et cetera. But really just to kind of show you that there's quite a few months where we're just going through a lot more work, and you might be contacted by me with questions. And that leads up to when you can expect your notice to proceed. So again, the earliest we got out notices to proceed this year was August, but some of those were projects that in the past we'd get out by June. So I think that just represents some of the slowdown with reduced capacity at the federal and state level a little bit. So that is why it takes a while. And then if you have to do a cultural resource survey, this could get pushed out even further, depending. And with our few minutes, I'll talk a little bit just about grant management requirements. So just things to keep in mind ahead of time. So you should review the grant agreement, the grant manual, after you submit the application or as you're working on the application, and then, study up to as you lead up to getting a grant if you are recommended. You'll have 2 years to do that project unless something arises that we need to look at extending that out, but plan for 2 years. If really we hold you to your scope, that ideally is that we will hold you to the deliverables that you submitted. But if there needs to be a scope change for any reason, you can submit a request for that. You should get ahead of that as early as possible. We say 30 days prior, but realistically, you should get a hold of me much, much earlier to go over that because some scope changes could just be way too far outside of what was approved by the committee and by federal highways. And then some of those could trigger more environmental or SHPO review. So question in the chat about safety and education, just going back to the 2 years. So unfortunately, we can only do safety and education grants for 1 year, and that is based on federal law. So safety and education grants, they can only run October 1st through September 30th, which is the federal fiscal year. And at least as for now, we're stuck with that 1 year rule. Even though I know many safety and education projects, it would make a lot more sense to do them for 2 years, but that is what we have right now. And then, of course, if you do need an extension, you get a hold of us early as well. Keep us informed. You'll have to do progress reporting every quarter if you're awarded. So just anything crazy that comes up as it often does, just let us know, and then we can assess whether or not an extension is needed as we get closer to the actual end date. But do your best to keep things on track and communicate to me what's going on. And then once you get a grant, you will submit reimbursement requests as you incur costs. The one nuance with RTP is you have to submit payment requests at least every 6 months. This is unique with federal highways and ODOT. Otherwise, they can technically inactivate funding for a grant. So that is really important to keep in mind as you build your budget, because I know that's not always realistic. And we do have ways to work with you if that's not realistic for your project. But ideally, you'd have some expenses regularly incurred. And just be ready to document everything as far as the expenses that we're paying you back for, as well as your match. And then we want to see your match incurred at that percentage or at proportionally as you request payments. And then, like I mentioned, if you are a nonprofit, you don't have the cash flow for reimbursement. There are some options we have, although there are some restrictions that come with that. So I can go over that with you one-on-one. Also important to know is we do hold 25% of funds until the project is completed. So you can request reimbursement or advances up to 75% of your funds. And then we stop there and wait to see that the project is fully completed before releasing that last quarter of funding. And as I alluded to, you'll do quarterly progress reports. That's going to be on the same OPRD grants website that you used to apply, just telling us the story about what's going on, if there's any issues, or just the general status. And then there's the celebration when you're all done. When you're done, there's just a final report, just like the ones you would be submitting throughout the life of the grant as far as reimbursement and progress reports. And then we want to see photos. We want to see an updated site plan if it's a construction project. And then I ideally will come out and visit the grant. That's not, or the project. That's not always possible. Sometimes it's just based on photos, or a colleague will go out. But ideally, we'll schedule a final site visit. And we love ribbon cuttings. We love publicity, newspaper articles, social media posts that your agency puts out, etc. So always good both to grow awareness of the program and just celebrate the awesome projects out there. And procurement, I'll just leave this here for reference for folks who aren't already familiar with procurement. There's some prevailing wage stuff, which I already said, but you can come back to this if needed. And then the last and final boring piece is retention. But that just means that you, as a recipient of federal funds, or the same goes if it's state or other public dollars, that you have to retain your records, because both OPRD and you as a grant recipient are subject to audit at any point. Federal Highways has audited us. The Oregon Secretary of State has audited us. They can audit you too. You probably have your own auditors, etc. So just as you do all this great work, just make sure you're documenting it all. And that is that. I'm going to go back to my first slide real quick. Any other questions? We've only got 2 minutes left. I don't see any. Going once, going twice. All right. Well, you all know where to find me. Call, email anytime. I am here to answer your questions. And then if you are waiting on me to set up an account on our website, I should get to those within the next couple days. I know I've got a bundle of them. So thanks so much. And I look forward to reading your proposals, hearing about your project, and celebrating all the great work that you all do. With that, we will end the webinar. Thanks, guys.